Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm here in this studio with Graham Currie. I'm in Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. And Graham, we have already had one go at this recording, so this is our second time round, hoping the gremlins don't destroy our audio like they did last time. If you would just like to say where you're calling from and what also made you want to come into this area of transport, perhaps what area of transport you are most interested in.
Well, I'm from Victoria in Melbourne on the lands of the Kulin Nation. I worked in the UK when I was a kid, really, in community transport organisations, helping people with transport needs. I did a bit of research for them. So when I came to Australia as a professor of public transport, I was quite always interested in transport needs and was somewhat surprised to find that Australia was really rampant with transport need throughout the entire nation. So I've worked in the bush with Aboriginal groups. I've worked in the cities with people on the urban fringe. So it turns out to be a gigantic problem in Australia that was very fruitful from a research point of view. So we ended up writing 3 books and 60, 70 research papers in the field. So we've managed to push the field along a little bit in this critical area for Australia.
You did some research in transport need in the UK. Then you came here. What were the main differences that you saw in the UK compared with what you saw here?
Well, I guess the obvious one would be the bush. The UK has its remote bits, Scotland, bits of Ireland, but not of the order of magnitude that Australia does. So I was in the Territory. I did the Alice Springs public transport study and worked in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek even. I remember talking to the mayor of Tennant Creek and asking him, how's your taxi service level in Tennant Creek? And he says, he's gone on holiday, so he'll be back in about a month's time. So they had one taxi. So I have done work in small areas. You asked the differences. Fundamentally, big difference is cities, which is that our lower income people in Australia tend to congregate around the fringe of cities because they have affordable housing. That housing is very poor service levels and they become very car dependent. One key characteristic I would say of Australia compared to the UK is that transport poverty dominates over transport disadvantage. And what I mean by that is it's not the fact that people haven't got transport, which is the problem. We do have that here in Australia, but it's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that low-income groups are forced to have cars because they have no choice. And this creates a great deal of pressure on their incomes. And there's this horrible combination of housing cost, remote living in fringe areas, and the need to have cars, which distorts their life and makes it difficult for them. And that's a key flavour of Australia compared to the UK, I think.
My observation living here on the outskirts of Brisbane is that I feel quite out of sight, out of mind. A lot of the people who design policy in Australia live closer into town. They might live in wealthier suburbs. They sort of don't really see what the need is because it's not part of their world. And as it is, they're not in the suburbs during the day, where people who are in the suburbs really need it during the day as well.
Yeah, I think there's something to what you're saying. But in addition, I'd also spread it out a little bit. I don't think there's a group of evil people doing policy sitting around trying to do things, but it's just a natural way the world works. They do tend to live closer to, where the work is done in these departments. And I'd actually add another group, which is very influential in Australia, and that's the media. I do a lot of interaction with media, and frankly, I spend a lot of my time trying to explain to them how the world really works, because they're often young people. There's a lot of money in media anymore. And also, they tend to live in inner areas near where the newspapers and media outlets are. So I have literally sent them out to the vestiges of outer Australia into the cranberries and things. They can't believe how they're going to get there. A lot of people live there every day. And then they suddenly begin to realize that life is different in these places. It is a huge part of Australia. I mean, even today, while we recognize we're not trying to sprawl, the housing we've got now, the targets we're having, at least half of the growth is going to be in the growth areas and the outer suburbs. So we're struggling to create development in inner areas. Politically, we struggle, and it's been the norm to expand in Australia for such a long time. The development system, which creates the housing, the transport system, it is all designed around being able to expand, but it's creating a huge amount of problem and livability problems for the future.
Okay, there are a couple of terms there. So one was transport poverty and one was transport disadvantage, because I don't think I know what that difference
Yeah,
is.
it's a subtle one. And also, to be honest, even the academics have got it wrong. I've been pointing this out to them. I think transport poverty is not having transport. And there's other words for this. Some people call it forced car ownership. Truth is, it's high car ownership on low income. And the opposite of that's easier to understand is lack of transport. We did a quite a big international study trying to understand what it was like to live without transport on the urban fringe compared to living with, very low income but lots of cars. What was interesting was it's not quite as typecast as you think in your mind. In particular, the people that had no transport, they lived in very accessible places. And there's not a lot of very accessible places in the fringe, frankly. But where there are, you'll find people that haven't got transport because they've got little choice than to choose to live the places where they can try and get around. All places have shopping centres, some kind, even if they're small. And those shopping centres do tend to have a bus of some kind. If you're lucky, you've got a train station. And that's where you can start getting around. Now, when we talked to these people, we asked how do they survive, with such poor mobility. And the irony was they said, oh, we love it. We can actually get to do more things because we're not using a high share of our income to try and get around. They actually said that. They're quite canny, to be honest. This view that poor people are backward or something is just not right. Everybody is sensible in dealing with their life choices. Not everybody, I'd say, but it's quite amazing how well adjusted people were to their environments. And then we have the other side of this, which is the people that found themselves living in a monk mansion, in a large house, quite nice houses, but away from everything. And they did suddenly realize they needed cars and they had to pay for them. Even these people adjust to that environment well, found that they did actually quite like cars. It's not like they're being forced on them by some evil person. They like the mobility it provides, but they completely and absolutely recognize that they didn't have a lot of choice about it. And they are paying money that they probably wouldn't have if they had a choice to do this. They were also extremely canny about how they went about living that way. In particular, they did a lot of travel to places where they needed to get things with the rest of the family. They tended to group together in trips and make less trips but together to share the trip. Some of them were adjusting by making sure they bought cheap cars, which is a short-term benefit but a long-term problem. But then again, some we also found were remarkably good at car maintenance, or they knew people, they were leveraging their friendship group in the outer suburbs who were good at this, and suddenly someone who knew how to maintain cars became a very popular person in these outer suburbs. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it. We were trying to understand who's losing out in all of this, and what we actually found was that people are adjusting to this. Not an ideal situation for anybody, and I think we can all agree if we could provide reasonable housing in places with better accessibility than these places, it'd be better for everybody, and I think we all agree with that. At the same time, people were adjusting maturely to their contexts. We did ask questions and measure what we call social exclusion, which is a much more complicated way of looking at disadvantage than just poverty, because disadvantages of many types. Often we get people with educational disadvantage who don't have jobs, who don't have income. The factors affecting disadvantage pile in, and this is a great word. Social exclusion comes from that. It's many perspectives that you have on this. We tried to measure these groups and say, well, which of these two groups are the worst off? And the answer was that the people that had no transport were the ones that were worse off. But it wasn't to do with their transport. It was to do with who they were. And that's the people that were living with lack of transport were usually single. They could be, single mums. They could be older and their partner's no longer with us, found themselves having to live without transport, and they'd adjusted accordingly. They'd got rid of the house and had got somewhere in a flat, which is more manageable. Whereas the people that were with the forced car ownership, the high car ownership on low income, were the battlers of Australia. They were young families just starting out, young families starting out by having their first house, often a mortgage, leveraged mortgage, which is part of disadvantage. They're highly leveraged. You can get a car with that, but they're very, very vulnerable to mortgage interest rates and fuel price increases because they're doing a lot of travel. In the outer suburbs, people will travel up to 3 times further than people would in the inner middle suburbs, which means that their transport costs are higher. But because these were families, male, female, plus children, they often had family networks and had a lot of family support, which meant that they weren't really excluded in a sort of a human interaction type of way. That was what was the differences between the two groups. Transport is influential in Australia, possibly more so than anywhere else, but it's not the king of every problem people have. It's life course and where you are in that, I think, that is about life satisfaction. This is what we found when we were trying to explore these contexts.
Yeah, so transport in and of itself isn't a thing. It's a means
Yeah.
to be able to get to your needs met. So whether that's with family, socializing, or work, or supermarket medical appointments, these sorts of things, and other transport, going from one place to the train station to be able to get, say, into the middle of Brisbane or somewhere. That is a difficult thing. My observation is that there are a lot of people who get these social networks. They do all come together and they do all hang out, and there is a very strong social network in a way that I didn't see that when I lived in wealthier areas, actually.
We actually studied this very aspect because there's a word called social capital, which is the benefit we get out of knowing other people around us and how they can help us in our life. Knowing someone's got a car, knowing someone's going to do car maintenance if you've got a lot of cars and they're expensive, or older cars. We studied the SIM issues in rural Australia and regional towns. And what we found in rural and regional towns was much stronger social networks which were acting to implement transport solutions for people and people looking out for each other, frankly. It was of course, it's less people out there. And so if there's people around you, you tend to know who they are. Whereas in the cities, that's harder because there's a lot of people from many different walks of life that you'll never get to meet. They're a little bit impersonal, the suburbs, let's be frank. Whereas in the bush and regional towns, there's key centres where everybody gets together, really. And people do have that network of knowing each other. So voluntary car sharing schemes, voluntary lift giving schemes are really very, very common in regional towns and rural areas. Less so in the outer suburbs of cities. I completely agree with your observation, but I think, in fact, the fringe of cities, it's much smaller than it could be if it was in a regional area. We were asking that question, why? Why couldn't we try and do something about that and get that to work? Here's a real truth, is kind of a shock to people, which is about transport disadvantage in Australia. Wherever you have transport disadvantage in Australia, there's often loads and loads of cars. It's just that people that need them haven't got them. The regional towns, lots of cars everywhere. The suburbs of Australian cities, they're piling out of the streets, and yet we need transport. It's an irony, isn't it, that we've actually got transport when it's just not linking the two together.
And I notice a lot of people drive very big SUVs. I don't know how they can possibly afford it. They must be financed up to the hilt. I just don't know how they can manage to make. They're huge.
They probably are business related. If you're a tradie or so forth, you can do that. Certainly the image is of a young person just starting out, got a bit of skills. The manufacturers know all about that. They are providing a utility vehicle that looks really good. They're not stupid. They know how to sell to these people. That's why we got these things. And the trend has been for larger and larger vehicles, which I think is a terrible thing. The road safety implications of all this are really disgraceful. Yeah, so that's right. But there are plenty of people there with small vehicles because that's all they can really afford to buy and use. So we have this discrepancy in vehicle size creating safety concerns.
I do see a lot of really huge vehicles. I notice it a lot with mums with kids. I think the car manufacturers must be targeting mums with kids as much as tradies.
One of the trends that's occurred in transport in Australia, changed in the last 20 years, is kids used to walk to school or get a bike. That radically changed In Victoria, we call these things the Torak tractor. Torak's an extraordinarily wealthy part of Melbourne, one of the wealthiest parts of Australia, actually. And you go to the schools there, you see the kids being dropped off in these enormous SUVs. We call them the Torak tractor because they're not tractors at all, they're luxury vehicles. And what's going on there is there's been a great deal of concern about kids' safety, them being picked up by terrible men or being hurt. Now, whether this is true, certainly it has been true in some cases, but what's going on there is a reaction really from parents to wanting to look after their children, completely understandable in a way, but it does create a new problem, which is access problems at schools with lots of cars. And ironically, the likelihood is that we've got a negative outcome here from a safety point of view, because the road safety problem at schools, because of drop-offs, is actually quite significant. And we do get crashes occurring and kids being hurt for that very reason. It's one of the trends that's going on, not a positive one again.
I think there is a lot of pressure, as you inferred there, about being a good mother. So what does it mean to be the good mother? And that driving your child now is seen as then you're a good mother. How can we begin to shift that idea back to allowing kids to ride bikes to school? How can we create that change?
The problem is the same problem we talked about at the beginning, developing the outer suburbs, because these suburbs are large and school catchments are getting bigger and bigger, which means the transport problems requires a car sometimes, because it's not possible to walk and cycle because we're designing suburbs and school facilities further away from things. And indeed, it goes well beyond school facilities. My whole career in parts of Australia working on transport needs is an endless list of health facilities being put in the wrong place, largely because the hospital people, they just want to put a nice facility somewhere. They don't think about where it is. They get some cheap land, and next thing you know, we've got a hospital in the middle of nowhere and no one can get to it. This is the disjointed silo thinking that's going on in this, and we can go beyond hospitals to many community facilities. Your question, what can we do about it? Well, schools are reacting to this. They are trying to manage access to the school in a better way for safety reasons, and also to encourage access by other modes. We're actually doing research at the moment in Victoria at school, how they think about public transport and getting to school by other modes. Some schools are taking the kids out at about sort of 8, 9, 10, where they'd go in a group using public transport to the city, and they'd get to experience what it was like and a bit of an adventure, see the city and come back again till they learn how to use it. Some schools as well organise what they call walking school buses. This is the idea that, well, some parents are finding it difficult to find time to do these things. A teacher will start picking some people up and walking through the suburbs to encourage them to do that sort of thing. Cycling paths dedicated for walking, which are safe, are all part of a solution for this sort of thing. These are all measures that you can take for this. I would be cautious about how successful they are. I think what we got here is a tsunami, and we're doing the best we can to try and mitigate it as best we can. Some schools are doing those things, but that's the answer to your question. I think it's here to stay and will continue. Fundamentally, we shouldn't be developing in the outer suburbs. We have very low density inner areas, and they can be enhanced. The livability, access to jobs, access to activities can all be done by walking in many European cities. The lifestyles there are very good. We are on a path for fringe expansion, which isn't helping us. We can design better fringe suburbs, new ones for local micro travel, but fundamentally they're car dependent for things like jobs. So yeah, that's the path we are, and that's where we are, I'm afraid.
I attended the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area Transit Summit last week online. We woke up at 3 a.m. to try and watch as much as we could. One of the things that one of the people was talking about was actually institutions like hospitals, schools, universities, these kinds of places actually have a significant proportion of transport needs. Like they are hubs for transport. And you just mentioned that they put in a hospital in a place which is stuck on the outskirts. And then afterwards they sort of go, oh, yes, well, I suppose we could put in an occasional bus service that runs once every 3 hours and only during short periods, even though these places have employment all day, every day. And then you have visitors, for instance, for a hospital. So it strikes me that actually a really good way to shift and increase the number of transport options would be to start with institutions.
Well, I think you're right about that. We spend a lot of our time in research talking to the health sector and the education sector. Frankly, they're hard to move. They're very large institutions with quite a lot of work. I can understand where they're coming from. There was an interesting example in New Zealand I saw. If you can spread school start times out, you can reduce the bus fleet size you need to get the kids to school. It requires the schools to rethink about how they do classes and so forth. So it's not easy. And frankly, as a way to save money, a useless idea because none of the education sector wanted to do it. Well, in New Zealand, it's a smaller country, New Zealand. It's a very proactive country. They came up with a different idea. They said, okay, well, we'll take the transport budget, which we pay for all these buses, and we'll give it to the school sector to pay for. They can organise it. And what do you know? Suddenly, these regional school areas were spreading out their school start times because they were saving money. So you see, it's about them and us a little bit. There's institutional boundaries. We're doing these sorts of things, and that's the transport sector's job to sort out. Silos, I don't know what we do about silos. I know that the problem is endemic in Australia, different departments, and even within governance, I think they all know they've got this problem of, hey, that's us, this is them. I don't know how we shake that up, but it's sure part of the big problem.
So last time we spoke about the DRT, the bus services that are basically on demand. They're quite expensive and they tend not to last. We've got a new one coming in Bribie Island. So I'm sitting there thinking, oh, how is that going to work then?
Yeah, so the problem here is conventional public transport is expensive. The outer suburbs is low density, often circuitous loops. Running big buses in these areas is tricky for government. It requires subsidy and increasing subsidy because it's very unproductive. Ironically, where we've got highest transport needs is the realized travel is not that big and it's not a big revenue. We need subsidy from government. Now, demand responsive transit, sort of taxi-like type buses, picking people up on demand, has been seen as a solution to this problem. And indeed, I started my career out on demand responsive buses, dial-a-ride buses in the UK. I used to drive them around for people with disabilities. Now, I have worked 40 years on these services. I can assure you that they aren't a clear solution at all. They're usually much, much more expensive than fixed route buses because it's hard to get much ridership on them. Don't get me wrong, they can be a solution when you've got a particular need and there's no other way of doing it. But the Sydney demand responsive trial buses were running at a subsidy of $100 per trip. Yeah, it would have been cheaper to get a taxi. And they weren't carrying huge volumes. So I'm afraid when we get new technology ideas, there's a huge volume of hype about them. Governments want to be seen to be doing modern, innovative things. And that's been the case for demand responsive transit for 40 years. Nothing's new about it. We did a study of DRTs globally, and I ran a big international workshop on it. And frankly, the average lifespan is about 2 years. And they're always called trials. The reason is that it's kind of recognized they're not going to last very long. And they call them a trial so that you won't lose face if you withdraw it. Trials are good as well, I have to say, though I like trying things out because, let's be honest, the models we've got now for solutions don't seem to do very well. So trying something else is a good idea. So I'm kind of on the fence here. I'm telling you that trials don't work, but at the same time, it's a good idea to try something else. Yeah, now the other alternatives in the suburbs, of course, are taxi type services. And we've tried these things. We've tried replacing buses with taxis. Canberra actually did it at night time. Adelaide did it at a place called Haddock Cove. And the idea being that, there's not much ridership at night anyway, and maybe we can just run it with a taxi, and running a big bus is expensive. And there were some cost effectiveness experiences with that. Taxi services often don't have too much demand at night time. We did have them. They were all withdrawn because largely it's tricky to do. They weren't seen as being a vast solution. What about taxi services themselves? Well, they're too expensive. And indeed, if you look carefully at taxi services in Australia, they really fail in the outer suburbs because the taxi drivers find it difficult to make money there. There's just not enough demand. It's the same problem as the DRTs. I think it's good to try new things like DRTs, but I think we should be realistic and recognizing they don't tend to work very well. The solution is not to have outer suburbs. It's hard to say that when we've got vast amount of Australia with that. We've got to deal with it. Densification over time could be a solution. We think of things of today. All of your comments about your life, where you are, is a today thing. In fact, in our lifetime, the world has changed quite a lot, and even the outer suburbs have changed. And slowly, Australia is getting more dense. we've got on a huge growth path. And that will slowly build density, even in outer suburbs. Focusing density on some key areas where people could live without a car is quite a good thing, I think. But yeah, I have nothing but long-term solutions here unless we can invest in needs-based transport. And community transport is that. And we have plenty of community transport schemes in Queensland who are trying to do these sorts of things, provide special services like shared volunteer driving schemes, for example, to help people in need who've got them on the fringe.
If I've understood what you're saying, part of the problem is that we've created this transport poverty in that people therefore have cars. So you end up, although there's a really high number of people who live here, so much of the transport implementation is already serviced by cars. And the number of people who are sort of left over who need something, actually, there isn't enough to fill that gap to make something more sustainable than what is here. I do feel that the cars costs, that too many of them are externalized, which makes they're effectively way too cheap. If you wanted to make it a little bit more fair between bus services and train services and cars, then it would be good to bring in some of those externalized costs that are currently not paid on the car.
Yeah, the key feature of the Australian dilemma with transport is that we would like to equalize this playing field of the car versus alternatives. Of course, the car's not paying its full impact on society, which is where congestion pricing, toll roads, and so forth all come in, try and equalize that. But part of the problem is that we've got a lot of people on low income forced to live using a car, and these guys are struggling with affordability. So it's really hard to bring in a taxation type scheme to equalize this, pay for alternatives to the car. Low income people are relying on it. This is the dual perspective of trying to solve this equity problem in Australia. This problem, this forced car ownership, is dominant. It's much, 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 much larger than transport disadvantage, and it's a growing problem. It keeps on growing and it's pervasive.
I think it is a huge issue. And I guess the thing that I really notice is the role of social isolation that comes from social exclusion. So that's one thing. But I think also people who drive everywhere are also socially isolated because they're completely cut off. I was talking with somebody the other day and he said, "Oh, I got the bus the other day." It was in Brisbane and it was awful. I walked up to the Ipswich Road. I waited for it. It was so noisy with all the cars going past, and I didn't know when the bus was going to come. I can just instead get in my car, close all my windows, turn on my music, arrive at the destination, and I pay $5 for parking. I have a lovely time. And I said, "Yes, but you're creating all the noise that you so hated when you were standing there at Ipswich Road bus stop." And he went, "Oh, I suppose I am." So he really didn't see the connection there. That's perhaps digressing from the problem of social isolation. But I do feel that people are very shut off from the impact of what their driving causes.
There's an academic called John Urry, URRY. It's the mobilities literature, which is quite phenomenological, which is about the personal experience of things, another type of research, but it's a real factor in human life. Yeah, he talks about how life can be very isolating when you do nothing else but drive on your own, because social interaction is part of what we are. We are gregarious animals. But if you live your life in a car, and often because of fringe development, that can be a long time in the vehicle, and we get these horror stories of super commuters who are 2 hours in a car, there to work, and 2 hours on the way back again. It means you are very isolated. Now, luckily these days we can listen to podcasts, for example, in the car. That's what I do. Books, and it's interesting, but we are effectively living on our own. This can be isolating. We actually measured this very issue when we were looking at car commuters, and we compared it to the people who were socially isolated because they didn't have housing, didn't have a car, and didn't have mobility on the urban fringe. We were able to actually try and find which groups were worse off, to split up transport disadvantage into separate groups and ask the question, who's worse off in all of this? And what we found is a group called rely on others. These are people who often live on their own. They used to have a partner who's no longer with them and who used to provide the transport. They now now living on their own, and they rely on often their kids who've got families now and take them for trips every now and then, or maybe a few friends that might take them out every now and then. These people are often quite cheerful and might not realize they've got a problem because they're just dealing as best they can with the problems they have in life. But they were found to have the worst social exclusion levels. So I don't know if that paints a picture of what's really happening in this. Our research, what we've been trying to do is split apart the problems and then measure social exclusion, which is actually a numeric thing you can look at and see which groups in all of this are worse off. And that was the one we really found who were relying on others in their life.
Yeah, I guess social isolation. And I was thinking with the commuters, the stress levels as well.
Fundamentally, these guys with commuter stress, which you can get on transit as well, particularly for crowding, but commuter stress is a part of this. And interestingly enough, one of the things we did find was lack of time. Lack of time is an issue, particularly for a wealthy, and that can be stressful as well. Different type of problem altogether, but it's part of commuter stress. But fundamentally, these guys were not socially excluded. They had plenty of money. They could find solutions. They could move if they had to. These sort of problems they have were more temporary than anything. It is a component of the whole system, and in cities, car dependent, is going to get more and more of that because congestion is going to grow unless we can find solutions for cities and densification, living in. And it's not very dense, frankly, what we're talking about for the future of Australia. Even though places like Melbourne, the housing will almost double, we'll still have quite a low density city and very green, just as a way of solving many problems at the same time and creating quite nice places to live. A lot of people who were involved in replanning the city of Melbourne, which has become a really fantastic place to be, that was densification. It can be done well and people value it and like it.
Those four-wheel mobility scooters are a kind of proxy transport that I see for seniors and people with disabilities because there's no bus service that is so good for them. How much research have you done on those as a transport mode?
We've done some. Certainly, there's a lot of research around their safety, and they're known to be problematic from that point of view because they're quite powerful, these devices. I'm afraid Australia doesn't have a history of, what should we say, careful regulation. We tend to be laissez-faire, letting things go without thinking of the consequences. There is a massive frustrated demand for travel, and these devices meet that. You can be subsidized to get these things as well. That's good in a way, but it does create its own problems because these things can crash, they can be unstable. I mean, I think their development tells us a lot about fringe Australia, about the aging population and the need for mobility solutions, personal mobility solutions. I'd rather have a world where we didn't need to have those sorts of solutions because they're problematic.
So just before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share about, I guess, what's possible? You've talked about the complexity. Say our listener is a transport planner. What would you suggest as an idea to trial?
Well, we've got to stop expanding, creating more problems like we have. We've got to stop the silo thinking, which put facilities in the wrong places, which builds bigger and bigger schools, which are harder and harder to get to. I'd like to see us doing the opposite of that. And if we're going to expand on the fringe, everything should revolve around mobility hubs, around activity centres, which are going to be more walkable, where we can actually provide some public transport to them. The answer fundamentally is inner urban development, middle Australia. And indeed, that's where the target areas for the housing crisis are. We should be welcoming this. It can be done in a way that's going to be attractive, should be done that way. I think we can find solutions. It's just going to take a long time.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you very much for coming back. Very much appreciated. And also for drawing out the complexities of out of suburban transport, because most people seem to focus their transport on the inner areas or have a very simple way of looking at it. It's so nuanced and it's so much about the human experience and what have we got and what are the options that we have. If you have anything else you would like to add before we close out.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I love your podcast. It's a great idea. You're asking all the right questions. When you find some solutions, do get back to me. I'd like to know about them. But I've been trying for 40 odd years to try and find these things.
A lot of clever people working on this stuff. I think the real answer is we need to move out of the silos, get conversations going across ways, and then I think you can start to create much more interesting outcomes.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Graham.
Thanks.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.get C-A-B-O-U-N-D, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E, there's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.